Ready to escape into a world of enchanting pixels? What is up, my peeps? And today we're going to be reading Speedrun, the authorized history of Sonic the Hedgehog. So let's get into it. Here's the introduction. I will not be reading all of this, because if I do, it'll make this video longer, so you can pause here and read if you want. Alright, so the Mega Drive years. Which is basically the 90s. Let's go. 3 men and a hedgehog. Sonic the Hedgehog's origins begin in a surprisingly cold-blooded fashion. In late 1989, Sega senior staff were deliberately seeking a mascot character which would allow the company to go toe-to-toe with Nintendo for the domination of the home console market. Surface Games, better known as Sega, was founded in 1940, relocating to Tokyo in 1951. A merger saw the firm rebranded as Sega in 1965, and it continued to strengthen its hold on the coin-operated amusement market. The company began making its wares to home users in 1986, with the release of the Master System Games Machine. Basically, the Master System. While more technically advanced than its nearest competitor, the device was only able to capture a small percentage of the market, which is dominated by the rival NES. Sega had enjoyed a moderate amount of success with its Mickey Mouse platform games in the sense of software featuring Disney character rather than poor quality efforts. The licensing agreements involved presented a drawback. However, there was an obvious need for the company's own character. The chimp-like Alex Kidd had spearheaded a number of titles on the 8-bit Master System console, but Sega had faced a constant struggle to differentiate its slow-moving hero from his obvious inspiration, Nintendo's Mario. A dedicated development team was forced to work on the title, to be released on the firm's new 16-bit hardware, the Mega Drive home system, better known today as the Genesis. Ideas were drawn from a wide range of pitches, with a competition being held in the Japanese company to devise its new star. Sonic's evolution was a gradual process, with early designs being based around a rabbit for speed, an armadillo for the ability to roll into a ball and attack enemies. This development of the character's attributes from gameplay elements is perhaps the most important factor in making the Hedgehog a complete entity, overcoming the contrived and corporate-driven nature of its origins. Many of the prototype designs from this period have since been introduced into Sonic games as separate co-stars, most obviously the armadillo concept. The note inscribed on the first sketches of a hedgehog translates as Mr. Needlemouse, and the character was referred to as both Sega Sonic and Super Sonic in the period before his final name was selected. Could you imagine if Sonic's name nowadays was Sega Sonic? That would be, or just Sonic nowadays would be Sega Sonic? That'd be weird. Though it would be really cool if Sonic's name was instead Super Sonic. You know, kind of a jab at Super Mario. Maybe that's why they changed the franchise name to Sonic the Hedgehog, as Super Sonic would sound way too similar to Super Mario. But anyways, more than any other entertainment medium, video games are a collaborative endeavor. But credit for the character's creation has been chiefly apported to 3 gentlemen. Designers, I apologize if I butcher this, Nataro Oshima and Hirokazu Yashikara, together with programmer, I definitely know how to pronounce this name, Yuji Naka. These figures were the leading lights of Sega's AM8 development group, quickly dubbed Sonic Team. That's interesting. So Sonic Team was originally called AM8. Cool. Anyway, it may sound odd to give credit for character creation to the title's coder, but Sonic, as we know him, was tailored around gameplay elements. Little touches such as the way the protective gold rings are scattered when the character is hit by an enemy or hazard, and the high speed of which he moves at, would have been impossible without Naka's technical expertise. Naka himself regarded his greatest achievement for the game as being an implementation of the optimal rotating special stages. In later interviews, he took pride in recalling how the concept had been dismissed by many of his colleagues as impossible. Most of the game presented semi-naturalistic locations, but the special stages saw Oshima and Yashara, I think I'm pronouncing that right, adopting a surrealist tone and creating mazes which Sonic navigated in search of the 6 Chaos Emeralds. The determining factor for the title's gameplay was the designer's strong conviction that it should be possible to control the Hedgehog using only one button in the directional pad, better known as D-pad nowadays. This focus on accessibility to new players would serve the series well over the years, removing many of the barriers to entry which had discouraged new players from preserving with the fiddly Alex Kidd. In addition to the triumphs of the Hedgehog's design and the speed of his movements, the third key element of the success of the title was the strength of concepts behind each level. Each location felt like a real and unique place. Much of this is due to Maestro Nakamura's soundtrack. I'm just gonna say MN soundtrack. Vindicating the decision to hire the composer behind the Japanese band Dreams Come True to provide the game's score, credit must also be given. However, the level designers are having the discipline to solely use certain gameplay gimmicks in one environment. Starlight seesaws, Spring Yard's moving blocks, and Marble Zone's volcanic geysers meant... Oh my god, I say geysers. Marble Zone's volcanic geysers, meant that certain actions would only be performed in particular locations. Although the visual design of each area looks rather clunky compared to the more streamlined visuals that would grace later titles, it still does the job of establishing an immediately identifiable setting. You never confuse one level for another, even at a brief glance. Oh my goodness, I cannot read today. Also, by the way, hey modern-day video game companies, including you, Sega, take the hint! Anyway, about confusing one level for another even at a brief glance. It's telling that the inclusion of a very obvious level select sheet, requiring only a few button presses at the title screen, didn't dampen the game's appeal. The zones were places that gamers actually wanted to visit again and again, not mere challenges to be overcome. The sheer joy of moving at speed provided a greater drive to replay than the side mission of obtaining all the Chaos Emeralds to watch a more upbeat ending sequence. It was only Sonic's opposition that didn't appear to respect the zone's barriers, with the different types of homicidal robot badniks sometimes deployed in a variety of settings. This somehow added to the impression of them as an invading force, rather than a natural part of the environment. The boss encounters at the end of each area made them even more memorable, with the animal-enslaving mad scientist Dr. Ivo Robotnik usually manipulating one particular aspect of the zone's architecture in a bid to crush Sonic. The only exception is his deployment of a wrecking ball affixed to the underside of his Egg-O-Matic flying vehicle at the end of Green Hill Zone. The Egg-O-Matic nowadays is referred to as his Eggmobile, by the way, but this wasn't the designer's intention. The ball was originally a mid-zone gameplay element, with a sequence where Sonic would have to run down a hill away from it being cut due to a lack of time in which to complete the code. I also would like to think that this might have been an Indiana Jones reference. Sonic having to run away from a rolling ball that's moving very fast down a hill. Sound familiar? Anyway, looking at the original design of Robotnik, it's striking how clean-cut the character appears. The sketches of the mustachioed scientist that Oshima created were musings on a possible hero for the piece. And it's only during direct looks to camera that the in-game sprite takes on a malevolent expression. The design is deliberately simplistic, with a vivid red shirt and yellow braces making the villain an obvious counterpoint to the cream and sky blue Sonic. The sound design is generally very strong, helping to make the connection for players between the visual appearance of items and their function in the game. Although the ring effect is not as pure as a note as the audio cue used when Mario picks up a coin, it's more distinctive and memorable. The TVs that Sonic smashes to obtain power-ups are a brilliant piece of visual design, giving a uniform appearance to the items, while allowing the inclusion of a simple indicator showing what each does. Although the styling of the restart lamppost wouldn't be complete till the second of the core titles, the basic concept is present. With something that changes as Sonic runs past it, being perfect for a marker of progress. One aspect of the original game that has persisted virtually unaltered through subsequent titles is the logo. If you look at almost any Sonic product released by Sega, you'll see the hollow of the letter O is italicized, carrying an echo of the character's shape when rolling at speed. The consistency of brand management is a sort of touch normally associated with the cast-iron control of the character that Sega of Japan would eventually exert. Surprisingly, it's equality to be found in the first half of the 90s, before such micromanagement became prevalent. In any case, this quirk is unlikely to have included under Japanese spices being absent from the character's name that in territory, literally, Sonuku's Hedgehogu, Sega of America initially attempted to use a more elaborate logo, with the character species displayed in a reddish swoosh before his name. But this was outlived over the years by the subtler O element. The basic battle being fought across the game was Sonic striving to free various smart animals imprisoned by the mad scientist at Universal Resonance? I think so I pronounced that. The title became a smash hit for Sega, even the inferior form of the game released in Europe during June of 1991. The poor conversion to the European PAL television format drastically reduced the speed of the title, which shared a number of bugs with the US iteration released on the same day. For example, in the West, Sonic would die instantly from contact with spike traps instead of simply losing his rings. A fixed version followed for the Japanese market, which also included a number of additional effects and animations, but it was in the West that the character quickly showed signs of becoming a phenomenon. Sega moved rapidly to capitalize on the surge in Mega Drive sales that followed. Although Sega's 8-bit Master System console had sunk without a trace in the US, it remained a viable propulsion in Japan and Europe. As a result, Sonic's debut adventure was adapted for a release on the machine and its portable Game Gear incarnation. The work was carried out by an entirely separate team from developer Ancient, and was released a year after the Mega Drive version. In terms of tone and art direction, Sonic the Hedgehog 1 8-bit is perhaps described as inspired by the original game. It makes a number of adjustments, including replacing half the levels with new concepts and, intriguingly, using a series of maps to chart Sonic's progress towards Robotnik's hideout. Honestly shocked this never made it into Sonic 1. It isn't just the forced simplicity of the game that distinguish it, but a less brash artistic style generally. That said, technical factors result in the gameplay being almost completely different. The title is a conventional platform game, with emphasis on being slow and careful and some rote learning of the levels necessary to make progress. It's still a remarkable game by weaker system standards, and deservedly so many copies, but it's a very different animal to its big brother. There is still much that's unknown about the circumstances of Sonic the Hedgehog 8-bit creation. A point underlined in late 2013 by the Sonic Retro Hacking Forum, users managed to uncover a music track and some gameplay aspects related to the Marble Zone, one of the levels exclusive to the Mega Drive title. That area's trademarked lava floods would have been impossible to achieve on the 8-bit hardware, but there were clearly ambitions at some point in development for as close a conversion as possible of the original title. That's a mouthful to say. For a while, it seemed that Sonic Team's first game would also be its last, with the group splintering to the extent that Yuji Naka actually left Sega. Over the years, there have been many stories on how prickly the programmer is to work with, and opinions are divided as whether it was a lack of status or his salary which had disillusioned the coder. The notable success of Sonic in the West left the company's American division in no doubt of the need for a sequel to the breakout hit, and they began attempting to lure Naka to return and head up development. While these negotiations were ongoing, Sega of Japan's higher-ups decided that they... wished for their unexpectedly successful creator to serve as a selling point for the proposed CD-based add-on for the Mega Drive. Several members of the original Sonic Team development were drafted in to create the resulting Sonic the Hedgehog CD, better known nowadays as Sonic CD, with Natoto, oh my god, I can't pronounce that name, N.O., there we go, directing the venture. The game saw another straightforward face-off between Sonic and Robotnik, who this time was attempting to harness the time manipulation powers of the little planet moon that periodically appears in the skies of Sonic's world. Although the game was released after the Mega Drive Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and the Mega Drive's Sonic 2, it is much more understandable creatively if considered first. Besides, its plot clearly places it before Naka's true sequel, which left Robotnik marooned in an isolated location. The title is notable for its unique gameplay mechanics, as straightforward linear progression through each zone will result in the player seeing only a fraction of the game's maps. Instead, scatter around each act to visit an earlier area of the level, then destroy the machines which Robotnik had dispatched to change history. The non-linear level structure proved to be a one-off experiment, and these days the game is better remembered for introducing two new characters that become an ideal part of the franchise. The design of the Metal Sonic enemy that Robotnik had constructed is simply inspired, giving life to the concept of a badnik that can counter each of the Hedgehog's abilities. Although destroyed at the conclusion of his Stardust Speedway duel with Sonic, no one believed that we'd seen the last of the android, and he would go on to return to the series many times. The other addition was Sonic's young female Hedgehog admirer, Amy Rose. Kidnapped whilst appearing in an early level, by the way, that being Palm Tree Panic, Sonic's rescue of the character is an afterthought in the game, with Rose only briefly appearing in one of the animated cartoon sequences which bookend the action. These movies are a key selling point of the title, and for years were looked to as a definitive guide on how Sonic should move when freed from the limitations of 16-bit sprite technology. Absolutely. Sonic CD serves as an interesting example of the lack of creative control which exerted over the character globally in his early years, with various regions of Sega free to present the game as they saw fit. The most notable example of this is in the soundtrack, which was discarded almost entirely for the US release. The Japanese version had a central theme for each stage, which appears in remixed form according to the time period the player is located in. The US version scrapped most of these tracks in favor of completely different compositions. While retaining the past music, it's fashionable to praise Naofumi Hateya's Japanese soundtrack, but both have their strengths. The Western Sonic Boom main vocal theme for the game is a much better effort than the Sonic Warrior song found in the found in the Asian version. Or Japanese version. Honestly, I agree. Sonic Boom sounds way better than Toot Toot Sonic Warrior. Seriously, Japan? Anyway. The second alteration of Sega Japan was less obtrusive, but also less artistically driven. The character of Amy Rose was renamed in the manual as Princess Sally? What the? The annoying co-lead of a US cartoon series, which we'll be looking at in Chapter 4. That cartoon series, by the way, being Sonic 7am. This action was somewhat undermined by Sega of America's inability to edit the in-game sprites, resulting in a change of name only given the visual differences between Amy and Sally. It's far from clear why they bothered. In many ways, the game is a parallel sequel to Sonic 2. It took the original game, including its engine and Sonic sprite, and tried to expand the previous title's gameplay. As composed to Sonic 2's bigger and faster philosophy, although many fans praise Sonic CD as the summit of the series, it's actually rather weak. The scavenger hunt mechanic, seeking time-jumping robots, doesn't work. The player is forced to firstly locate a past post, then find a suitable place for a time-hopping sprint, and finally track down the two smashable gizmos located in the past version of that stage. It's a tedious and unnecessary distraction from the simple joy of movement, which renders the future location completely pointless, as there's no gameplay reason to visit it. Weak level design is the final nail in the coffin, with Quartz Quadrant and Wacky Workbench, in particular, being simply dull to play. Fortunately, on the other side of the world, Yuji Naka was having more success in recapturing the first game's magic. Sonic Tuesday. That's funny. While Sega of Japan were happy to allow a more experimental approach to its new mascot, Sega of Japan was under no such illusions. Mega Drive consoles were selling like hotcakes, and the reason was obvious, and a sequel to Sonic the Hedgehog was urgently needed. The US subsidiary took the rehired Yuji Naka and placed him in charge of rookie development team at its Sega Technical Institute. Naka was fortunate enough to persuade Hirokazu Yoshihara to join him in immigrating to America, and the designer resumed his level layout duties at the reinstituted Sonic team. Reformed Sonic team, basically, that's what that's trying to say. Despite an extremely short 9-month development period, Sonic 2 evolved to be the definitive game in the series, becoming the title that everyone thought the original had been. Recognizing that the virtual locations on offer had been one of the main draws of the first game, the sequel offered a great number of shorter levels, with the number of acts reduced to 2 per zone. Aside from Metropolis Zone, which gets 3, which is just weird, but okay. The introduction of the standing start spin dash maneuver was emblematic of the faster pace and more immediate action. Another change was made in light of the public's attachment to the character. The only piece of conscious storytelling in the first game, where Robotnik unexpectedly dropped Sonic from the Scrap Brain final area back into the hazards of the Labyrinth Zone. Basically Scrap Brain Zone Act 3, or better known by fans as Labyrinth Zone Act 4. Anyway, was considerably expanded upon. Sonic 2 shows how its hero moves between the final set of locations using the newly introduced Tornado biplane to attack Robotnik's Wing Fortress base. A further sequence at the end of that level dramatized him hitching a ride to the orbitable Death Egg, the Star Wars parodying ultimate weapon that Robotnik had been constructing throughout the game. Technical limitations appear to have forced the abandonment of an earlier cut scene, which Robotnik would have demonstrated the Death Egg's power by a laser strike destroying the Metropolis Zone, possibly a reference to Independence Day. Sonic and his new sidekick Tails would then have to fight through the ruins of the city to reach the tornado. Sadly, the second version of Naka's Mega Drive graphics engine wasn't up to coping with the visual swap that would be needed for the resulting Genocide City Zone. The idea was dropped, and the completed level designs were used to form a third act of the Metropolis Zone. Ha! I mentioned that. With the mid-stage apocalypse notion later remounted in Sonic 3's Angel Island Zone. Oh, interesting. Speaking of Tails, the main expansion of the gameplay concepts from the original were linked to the Fox to properly known as Miles Prower. It's surprising how many people didn't notice that truly terrible pun in the character's name. I don't think it's terrible, I think it's rather funny. Or I think it's rather funny. Very 90s sounding, which is completely fine in my opinion, but anyways, in one-player mode, the default option is Tails dogging Sonic's footsteps, using his helicopter Tails flight ability to catch up when the Hedgehog inevitably zooms away from his companion. The arrival of Sonic's mechanically minded sidekick was a clear statement of intent, expanding a solitary experience into one that featured anytime drop-in co-op gameplay, to use today's vocabulary. Having a second player controlling the Fox was highly advantageous, as his infinite wise meant that he could bear the brunt of Robotnik's improved array of badniks with impunity. This was just the tip of the iceberg. However, compared to the inclusion of most comprehensive split-screen versus mode the series has seen, the contest pitched Sonic and Tails against each other across a number of stages, with the eventual victor judged on a broader array of categories than a simple race result. Power-ups used and gold rings collected were also taken into account in scoring each contest. There are several interesting artistic shifts from the previous title. Robotnik's egomatic flying vehicle has a more Health Robinson feel to it than other appearances, being visually cobbled together from various desperate components, in contrast to the semi-coherent journey around South Island that the first game offered. The levels here are ordered for visual gameplay and gameplay diversity. The opening idyllic Emerald Hill is followed immediately by the smog of chemical plant. Originality of the level concepts is maintained by the slight twists that are placed on the core ideas and returned from the first game. For example, Emerald Hill has a significantly more tropical feel than than Sonic 1's Green Hill Zone, and the Metropolis Zone is less industrial and more of a city than its scrap-brain metal stage predecessor. The largest shift was toning down the surrealism of the special stage. The technical enhancements across the whole title meant that the game didn't have to resort to such cheap tricks to give a drastically different feel to the areas from which Sonic recovers the Chaos Emeralds. Ooh, that was a lot to read. The camera was positioned behind Sonic as he peeled down a ring-strewn half-pipe. A more tangible reward for retrieving the gems was provided this time around in the form of Super Sonic, a Chaos Energy-infused version of the hero. As would become established convention, the indestructible yellow avatar of the Hedgehog was underplayed in the game, while additional fiction versions of the character see him both elevated to near omnipotence and reduced to a bloodthirsty psychopath. Fleetway Supersonic. Anyways, Sonic Team seemed coherent to treat Supersonic as simply a more powerful version of its lead character. While his animation suggested to be capable of flight, he's firmly anchored to the ground. and is used consistently to diminish the player's number of rings. If the tally falls to 0, Sonic reverts to his usual self. MN again supplied the music for the title, later going on to rework the ending theme as the vocal track Sweet 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 on his next album. The Japanese influence on this game was an exception to the generally Americanized tone of the franchise at this point. While the European release of Sonic 1 had retained Oshima's line work for its box art, the publication of the sequel saw a painting by American artist Greg Martin adopted. The prolific Martin would come to defend Sega of America's house style, but his depiction of Sonic and Tails stood in front of a large 2 is probably his... But the depiction of Sonic and Tails standing in front of a large 2 is probably his most famous creation. Really? So Greg Martin is an artist? Or was one, anyway. Okay, interesting. Unsurprisingly, there was a massive marketing push for the game's launch, with the US date dubbed Sonic Tuesday. Although Sonic 2 rightly enjoyed remarkable sales figures, it's important to remember how near to the wire its release was. More than any other Mega Drive Sonic, its development was characterized by stops and starts. The Sonic fan community has been discovering unfinished beta versions for years, the most famous of which includes a nearly complete additional level, the Hidden Palace Zone. Which, fun fact, Hidden Palace Zone will be included in the mobile version of Sonic 2 as a discoverable Easter egg. Anyways, it was a stormy experience of building the game that would lead Yuji Naka and Hirokazu Yashihara to demand major changes to the structure of the US-based Sonic team before they undertook development of the Hedgehog's next adventure. A slightly different approach was taken for 8-bit version of the second game. The product developed by Japanese studio Aspect was obviously an entirely different title from its 16-bit namesake. The plot revolved Robotnik having kidnapped Tails, explaining the fact that the fox wasn't present in the action, and Sonic is charged with collecting the Chaos Emeralds in order to rescue his sidekick. In theory, the game is a fixed version of the first Master System release, with its engine rebuilt to allow the character to move at greater speed. Unaware that it is unable to offer the blistering thrills of its namesake, the game goes to town on mid-level gimmicks, with Sonic using hang gliders and minecarts in his bid to rescue Tails. Even minor niggles, that's funny, that's a funny word, anyway, have been addressed, with the previous game's Sonic sprite corrected to be a deeper blue, and his trainers now red instead of brown. This good work is unfortunately undone by an extremely high difficulty level, which presumably stemmed from a truncated development period and some horrid art direction. The game's style lacks crispiness, with the reused sharp main sprite contrasting with the muddy and inspid zones he visits. You can already see the beginnings of the two surreal level concepts that have characterized aspects of later 8-bit Sonic games. In the rush to capitalize on the success of Sonic the Hedgehog, there was a noticeable lack of coordination between the various Sega development teams. As we saw in the previous chapter, the character of Metal Sonic was a key element of Sonic CD, yet the 16 and 8-bit versions of Sonic 2 both featured rival takes on the idea of a robotic Sonic doppelganger. I've never noticed that. Why was the Metal Sonic in Sonic 2 completely different than, Metal Sonic from CD? I've never understood that, but anyways, the climax of the Mega Drive game had the player facing a statue-esque stone-like behemoth on board the Death Egg, while on the 8-bit Sega machines, the penultimate boss of the games was the more agile Silver Sonic. Neither robot's looks has the flair of Kazuyuki Hoshino's stylish Metal Sonic design. Basically, the more famous Metal Sonic from Sonic CD that's appeared since that game's creation. Anyway. And it's strange that these variations of the same theme would be tolerated. This early period is one of the most interesting terms of creative control to the franchise. With the first game, Sega of Japan effectively offered the character to its subsidiaries to the market as they saw fit, taking account of the nature of their territory, although some ideas occurred independently to all three firms involved, such as Sonic's Power Sneakers having a friction-reducing function to stop the character setting his feet alight. These notions were the exception. The results produced some interesting quirks, such as the Robotnik Eggman debate. Sonic Team renamed its recurring villain Dr. Eggman, but the company's Western arms felt that a more sinister moniker would have a greater appeal. The character was therefore dubbed Robotnik for the earlier European and US releases of the game. Despite this, the scientist's egg fixation was retained in much of his additional fictional dialogue. Sega Europe was free to construct its own concept of the same character, formalized in the cytofactual paperback, Stay Sonic. This utilized much guidance material which the subsidiary created for its use by its merchandising partners. The attitude towards origin stories for ongoing fictional characters is an interesting cultural phenomenon between Western and Asian nations. It's hard to think of any superhero from American or European comic books that isn't defined by how they obtain their powers, but the Japanese tend to give a little more attention to this aspect, being more interested in the finished article. Sonic Team felt no need to flourish its character with a backstory, being content to just present the Hedgehog's adventures as a fat accompli? That's a weird word, but okay. Sega Europe, on the other hand, crafted a detailed tale that not only explained why Sonic is blue rather than the brown normal for his species, but the driving factor behind Robotnik's insanity, and even the reason why the pair's world is covered in gold rings. The tale of Dr. Kintobar and his ill-fated bid to rid the planet Mobius of all evil formed the bulk of Stay Sonic. The book was rounded out with tips on both incarnations of Sonic 2, together with shorter chapters analyzing the game's various badniks and detailing of matters such as Sonic first met Tails. The most striking feature of the European conception of Sonic is literally taking the world presented in the games as gospel, in the absence of creative input from the character's creators. It was a sensible approach, perfectly chiming with the views of the game's younger players. The European Sonic mythos gave its additional fiction writers much material to work with, and remains fondly remembered. The crowning glory of this continuity came in prose form. A total of 4 novels were released by Virgin Publishing, all running about 200 pages from a collective of 3 writers. Those names you see up there at the top of your screen. Published under the pseudonym Martin Adams. They're best thought of as young adult books rather than children's titles, mainly due to the complexity of plotting and a tendency to overreach in terms of content. For example, one book featured a vividly described passage in which Sonic spin attacks a zombie chicken. Expecting that his opponent would be revealed to be a robot, he is somewhat nonplussed by the shower of awful which results. The books are the most faithful adaptation of the Mega Drive's games imaginable, taking the architecture of the titles entirely literally. This means that the planet Mobius is actually split into zones the same way the UK is made up of counties. Interesting. Which can only be traversed at certain key points. Unlike the Sonic team's conception of Sonic, the character is resolutely not a drifter, and his main motivation in each of the books is to save his friends. These are drawn from the list of names by the animals that populate the games, as furnished by Sega Europe. The only original addition to the cast of good guys is Mickey the Donkey, a dodgy Cockney engineer. His roles in the stories increasingly foreshadows the 1998 reinvention of Tails as a techno genius rather than Sonic's biggest fan. Really? Mickey the Donkey? Oh my god, I said the name wrong again! Ugh. Mickey the Monkey. Okay then. Really? Really, Sega? Mickey Monkey? Anyways, in what would become an established trope, Robotnik gains his robot sidekick, although Egger's true nature turns out to be a plot point of one of the books. Speaking of the mad scientist, Adam's take on the character is truly magnificent, managing to entertain through incompetence without ever losing his capacity to create menace. Aside from the first book, which focused solely on Robotnik's development of a new weapon, the novels each took a sci-fi staple as their inspiration. They consisted of a refreshingly complex time travel tale, a cyberspace adventure, and a horror epic that follows Robotnik's branching out into genetic engineering. At the time, the quality of the books was unprecedented, and even how they mount a reasonable claim for the title for the best piece of Sonic additional fiction. Although they don't provide a high concept for the character, their selfless adherence to the tropes of the games remain charming. Adams always judges exactly the right moment to break the fourth wall, usually by having Sonic regally commenting on proceedings. The writer's ability to take each of the simple tropes they borrow, make them fit perfectly into European Sonic verse is magnificent. And if you ever have a passing fondness for the early 90s version of the character, it's worth tracking down secondhand copies online. Also from the same staple came a series of choose-your-own-adventure books, which sadly lack the wit of their conventional pro siblings. You can't fault the accurate reconstructions of the first two Mega Drive titles' world, but there isn't the sense of mischief that makes the novel such a joy to read. The earlier releases are probably the best of the bunch, with the second book containing an impressively complex pen and paper simulation of the video game's mechanics. Later books such as The Zone Zapper and Sonic vs. Zoink, yet another spin on the Metal Sonic concept, are faithful to the ethos of the series, but don't make much an original contribution. A third range of European Pros books was published by Ladybird? Really? Ladybird? Oh my goodness. Okay, hold on. I'll continue reading this and I'll quickly explain why I reacted to the way I did to Ladybird. Targeted at younger children, with Sonic the Story being another paraphrasing of the concepts from Stay Sonic. But books weren't the only way in which Sonic was able to escape the confines of video game cartridges. And neither were CDs, either. Cartridges and CDs, basically, by just quickly rereading that last sentence. Now, the reason why I reacted the way I did to Ladybird is because Ladybird actually made, I believe they made some of the classic era Thomas and Friends books. So it's very interesting that there exists Ladybird Thomas books and Ladybird Sonic books. That would be interesting. Very long. So anyways, that is the first. So anyways, on that hopeful note, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Talk to y'all later.